Welcome back to the Week 2 edition of the Roto Curve videos, where Jim and I are talking about running backs now. But before we get to business, let's talk to you about some of the offers we got going on at rotocurve.com because they are pretty sweet. We have got a great offer with if you just enter promo code CURVE in the coupon box. You only got to pay $5 weekly for what should cost you $7. This includes position rankings, projections, cheat sheets, tools like DVP, points per attempt, red zone utilization, all the stuff that we'll be mentioning. You get optimized DFS lineups for DraftKings and FanDuel, access to player ownership percentage, and Roto Curve always has those first. So once again, use promo code CURVE and pay $5 instead of $7. That saves you a $2 bill. Jim, do you still have any $2 bills anywhere?
I don't, but this is an old school reference. If you've ever seen the movie Better Off Dead, there was the newspaper kid who kept saying, "I want my $2." So he chased the guy the whole movie, and he said, "I want my $2." So maybe you finally pay that kid off, and he'll stop chasing you. So
there you go. I don't know that one. The only money reference I remember is from South Park with "I need about tree fitty," but
right.
It's only $2 instead of tree fitty, so you'll have to save $1.50 elsewhere. But let's get to the running backs because it is an interesting running back week. Jim, let's start with our cash game guys. I know you got a ton of them this week, but can you limit it down to just a few that we think are worth using for cash?
Yeah, I like C.J. Anderson. I know it's paying up, $6,800 on DraftKings, but I actually feel like his usage rate and just the way that team's going to build, and also there's something interesting happening there. Last year, they only ran, multiple players in the backfield. I think like 30 plays the whole year. They ran 20-plus of those plays last week. Kubiak really likes that multiple look. C.J. Anderson averages 4.4 yards before contact over the last, since the start of last year in those looks, meaning, it's really something that really works in terms of versus that whole pistol look that they had with Manning. The idea is the offense is built around this guy. I think he's just a cheaper version of Lamar Miller in the sense of volume. But the matchup's nice. I mean, I think we saw Abdullah and Riddick both, do whatever they wanted basically against the Colts. And I think we're going to see that again with Anderson, except consolidated into one player. They clearly aren't going to trust, Booker too much. I think you're talking about 20, 25 touches. That's pretty safe. He's one of the rare bell cows. Maybe there's 7 bell cows in the league right now, 8. He's one of them. So I think C.J. Anderson's worth paying for. One more guy that I really trust in cash would be Justin Forsett. I know, he's in a split with Terrence West. I think he's on the higher end of the snap share, 60-40 kind of snap share. Buck Allen didn't even get, any exposure last week. I think you're going to talk about Forsett had 170 yards from scrimmage last year against the Browns. This Browns team, they're basically like the NFL version of my Sixers. We can call Hugh Jackson is Hinkie Jackson now. But really, I just think 15 touches and 100-plus total yards is fairly not bankable, but it's easy to project for Forsett.
Yeah, if I'm spending up in cash, I agree with the C.J. Anderson play. If I can even pony up a little more money, I like Ezekiel Elliott behind that awesome offensive line. I think you look at D'Angelo Williams against the Redskins last week, and you could kind of see why. I think Elliott's an explosive player, and I think, if Prescott can get that team moving up and down the field, which he showed, and maybe even threaten with a passing touchdown or two, then that opens things up for Elliott, and he could have a really nice game with people not really thinking about him. But we kind of talked about it in the quarterback video that I really like the receivers this week, so I'm willing to spend down at running back. And my top back of the week is Jeremy Langford against the Eagles. I mean, both Crowell and Duke Johnson averaged over 5 yards a carry last week. So if we thought the Eagles defense was just good last year because they were on the field so often because of, the fast Chip Kelly offense, we learned that wasn't true in week 1. So Jeremy Langford's a guy who's, Crowell rushed for 62 yards and conceded those third down snaps to Duke Johnson. Langford, we don't have to worry about that. He's the guy on first, second, and third. He gets the goal line carries. He gets receptions. So just 9,100 on fantasy draft. That is a no-brainer to me. Then another guy I like that, we were talking about in the opener that you might not like that much is Theo Riddick. I think this guy is legit. You look at those snaps last week, 40 for Abdullah and 24 for Riddick. But what people don't understand, or at least forgot, is that he sat out nearly an entire quarter when they were looking at him for a head injury. So, if he played, those snaps could have been closer. he averaged both more yards per carry and more yards per catch than Abdullah. And I think this Titans defense is pretty solid against the run. And I think that kind of would be Abdullah's role that they would take away then. And they're going to have to replace it with the short passing game. And again, Riddick caught 80 touchdowns last year, the same amount as Decker or Allen Robinson. So they don't have any problem using him. I think, this Titans team was more susceptible to receiving backs last year. So I think this makes all the sense in the world that Theo Riddick kind of, they are like option 1A and 1B, but I think Riddick could be option 1A, and he's really, really cheap this week. So those are the two cash running backs I like. I'm curious to know why you don't like him this week.
One, there's going to be, like in cash, it doesn't really apply as much, but I think there is going to be some recency bias of people chasing this guy and thinking, because it still was, 12 touches or something, that he did all this damage on. The other thing is the Titans actually have given up the least receptions to backs over the last year. I think league average is like 89 receptions to backs, for teams. They've given up 57, 6 yards per attempt, not even just per completion. So I think a lot of that has to do with the way Dick LeBeau likes to space out his linebackers. Like, he has rangy, fast guys who aren't actually that good. Avery Williamson, Wesley Woodard. But those guys are, going to collapse on those flats pretty quickly. I think this is a week that I'd actually prefer Abdullah, but again, I think we can guess that both will be in the NFL next week, so it'll definitely be a better bet if we put it up because, like we said in the quarterbacks thing, I said C.J. Spiller was going to be valuable, but he's not in the NFL right now. So.
Yeah, you know what? I said they were susceptible to passing backs. They were kind of lower. They were a little bit higher in terms of receiving yards to backs and in terms of targets.
Gotcha.
But they did get a bunch of red zone touches as well. And again, I think this is one they were pretty just stout against running backs. And I think that, if that's the case, they have no problem lining up Riddick and everywhere. And again, for this price, even if they did give up, some of the fewest receptions to backs, I think Riddick looked so damn explosive in the opener that I'm willing to go back to the well. He catches a lot of passes. They're just going to use him, like almost like a slot receiver at times. So
there's a lot of volume there to be had. I mean, it's pretty clear. Yeah. I agree with you. It's pretty clear that they're going to operate with 5 and 6 yard downfield passes, and that's how they're going to run. So I agree. It's kind of how they're going to move the ball. So. It could be unique to Detroit, too. I mean, Detroit is doing really well applying that model. 70+% completion percentage, they're not going to stop doing it.
Right. Well, let's shift to tournaments because there are some guys like Riddick that we like that probably could be used in cash games as well. I'll open it up to you first, and I'll give some alternatives that are the same kind of players after you are done.
Sure. I actually like Latavius Murray a little bit. I think the floor isn't incredibly high just because we saw some snap issues last week, but I also think that was game script. I think you're talking about an Oakland team that was constantly chasing the scoreboard, chasing that Saints offense. They made it all the way back, but that was really with the help of Jalen Richard, and they even did a lot of 3 and 4 wide receiver sets that kind of eliminated the running back from contention. At the same time, the Falcons gave up the opponent this week for Oakland. The Falcons gave up 16 rushing touchdowns over the past year. They have young guys, Deion Jones there in the linebacking core. He's going to, miss a lot of tackles. He graded out poorly this week. I just think there's a chance if the game script is positive as home favorites. I think you could see that 20+ workhorse game from Murray. I do think the reason I say tournament is just because I think there's some variance to his outcome. The other guy I like is a lot cheaper, but it's Shane Vereen. Last year he had 9 catches for 60 yards in that shootout against the Saints. Again, the Saints give up a lot of points to everybody, but they also give up a lot of points to running backs. They give up the second highest yards per attempt, 7.7 yards to running backs over the last 17 games, going back to the start of last year. So those are 2 guys that I like that have Forsett might actually be the more bankable guy because he's going to get his 6-7 targets. But I think if that goes full shootout, you're going to see a lot of I think he could even out-snap Rashad Jennings just because that's kind of how they move, kind of in a Woodhead kind of breakdown. I think he could be their Woodhead this week.
Yeah, so let's say if you don't like Riddick, I'm going to start with Woodhead in tournaments because there's a lot to like about him after week 1, to be honest with you. We were talking about it before the show, and it kind of just clicked to me that, yeah, they were up that whole game, and Danny Woodhead out-snapped Melvin Gordon 50-23. He out-touched him. I think it was 21 to I don't have Gordon's touches, but it wasn't that many.
14.
14 exactly. I mean, he averaged more yards carry. He caught that touchdown. So Woodhead kind of looks like their guy, and he rushed for a career high 103 carries under Winston Hunt the last time they were there. He caught 76 passes that year. So he was a true, wide receiver, running back one in PPR formats with Winston Hunt before. He looks like he could get there again. People don't realize, especially fantasy draft and DraftKings, how valuable these receiving backs are.
Full point in both formats. So
exactly. I mean, people are willing to spend up for Jarvis Landry, and then they look at Danny Woodhead and they're like, I don't know. The guy doesn't do much, but that's just not true. I mean, he finished as RB4 last year, so I think Woodhead, there's always a lot to like about him, especially at this price. I think D'Angelo Williams pretty much proved his worth last week. Whenever Le'Veon Bell's out, the Steelers running back one, whoever he is worthy of starting. So I don't even really need to get into him. He catches passes. He does everything. Cincinnati's a little bit tougher of a matchup, but I don't care. I'll use him anywhere. And how about LeGarrette Blount? Carried the ball 22 times last week. This Miami team, you would think that it would be a close game. If not, New England should pound them. So Blount kind of looks like a guy who's kind of what's linked to the game script is the word I'm looking for. Sometimes I have a hard time finding these words. But assuming they're up, and I think they're going to be, I mean, there's no reason he shouldn't carry the ball 20-plus times. But the reason I would save him for tournaments is I don't really trust Bill Belichick. I know that price tag is really nice looking. I mean, I was trying to create cash lineups and he fit in there, but I can't do it there. You mentioned Vereen, who I liked, so I'm going to agree with you there. And one other guy that we haven't covered yet, but I would kind of be legitimately comfortable using in tournaments is Devontae Freeman. And, I think the public perception on him is pretty bad after last week. He barely outsnapped Tevin Coleman, but they are playing a team against the Raiders, exactly. Travaris Cadet caught the touchdown against them last week, so I think there is some receptions to be had. And, Freeman's still a good player. Everyone's just kind of alluding that Coleman's it's going to be a 1 and 2 thing, but I still think Freeman, at least in the short term, earned his worth last year. And, after everyone's way off him, his price went down. I think this could be a time to get one more big game out of Devontae Freeman against the defense that allowed 30-plus points last week. So should be interesting to see what his ownership percentage is. Do you have anything else to say at the running back position?
There's just one more guy that I'll mention. I really doubt, considering he just got out of the hospital, I doubt Chris Ivory plays this week. Again, I'm not a doctor. I only play one on podcasts. But I think there's a chance that Yeldon has the sole job again. They kind of ran him a ton and didn't give a lot of targets, but I think there's a lot of evidence to get him in space against Manti Te'o. I think allowed 7 receptions on 7 targets last week. So in the flat. So I think there's some upside there. Denzel Perryman, he's only really on runs, but he's only playing half the snaps. There's a lot to exploit there, I think. Melvin Ingram isn't great in coverage. These are all linebackers for the Chargers. I think there's a lot to exploit there. So Yeldon's a guy that I actually wouldn't mind in cash or tournaments. He's a guy who kind of crosses over for both for me because I think the ceiling's really high, but I also think the floor is there as long as he's the sole guy in a game with, a point total, again, that's hovering around, the high 40s. And, Vegas doesn't really know what to do with it. It's only a 3-point game. They're not sure what Chargers team shows up. The Chargers are just really generous to both the pass and the run against running backs. So I think there's a guy right there who, again, didn't have a very sexy week last week. People weren't that into it, but he's not sharing with anybody. So there's really no risk of usage.
Right. Let's go back and review with our favorites because I think people need to know that. And I'm going to start with cash game, my favorites, Jeremy Langford and probably CJ Anderson, who you covered initially. But really, I also can fit Woodhead in there, even though he's my favorite in tournaments as well. I think using Woodhead this week is a winning proposition at that 5,200. You've kind of convinced me to lean him over Riddick, and I think, neither of them cost really that much on either site. Right. And I would have some exposure to both, but I think those are my 3 favorite backs of the week. Langford, Woodhead, Anderson for cash. Then if we're going tournaments, I'm going to add like Garrett Blunt in there, and I'll always add D'Angelo Williams. I think those are the 5 that I'm going to kind of focus around, with Langford probably being my most owned back. What about you, Jim? Who do you like as your staples?
My staples that I mentioned in cash would be, again, CJ Anderson. We covered him. That's pretty obvious. I'll actually vault, as this is a clause that if Ivory's out, I actually like Yeldon in cash. He's still cheap. There's still some mystery to his usage with Ivory's situation, so his price is reasonable. The Chargers give up 90 receptions and the most yards per attempt, 8.62 yards to running backs in the passing game last year, and including this last week. And then Forsett as well. I just think, again, I just want multiple shares of this Baltimore offense if I can get it. People aren't really enthused by the Ravens because those depth charts are so hard to read, but I think he's the guy to get between him and West, especially in point per reception leagues. And then, DraftKings and draft. What else? And then in terms of tournaments, Shane Vereen is a guy that I'm interested in. I think he could have 75 total yards pretty easily against this Saints team. I think in the no huddle setup, he's the guy that gets the looks, not Jennings. And then who else are we looking at? I like Latavius Murray. Latavius Murray in a situation where multiple touchdowns aren't likely, but are quite possible.
Yeah, so we like the receiving backs this week. You hear it. I mean, we've mentioned Woodhead. We've mentioned Riddick, who caught at least 3 passes in all but one game last year. We mentioned Shane Vereen, who looks nice in that matchup. I mean, it looks like a game where they're going to scheme him in. He's either really, a top 10 running back or just kind of quiet. Right. So a week for receiving backs. We like a few of the workhorses, but that's what we got for you this week to review. Use that coupon code CURVE to save $2 on a weekly premium membership at Roto Curve. You get the rankings, projections, cheat sheets, must-have tools. You get optimized DFS lineups. You get access to player ownership percentage. Again, that's only $5 instead of the $7 if you didn't use the promo code. So just use it. Jim and I will be back soon talking about receivers and some of our favorite stacks. So stay tuned.